Everybody, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that carving out time from your work days is a tough thing to do, and I know that you're going to get a lot of value from the session that is going to follow. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we really kick off. If you didn't get the notification when you joined, then I will just remind you. This session is being recorded. None of you are on camera, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue. But if you do ask questions and we refer to you by name, if you want to ask a question anonymously because you don't want that to be present on the recording, that's absolutely fine. You can do so. You can ask us not to reveal your name, but that recording will be shared after the event. We're going to keep the Q&A open during the session, but the intent is that we'll address those questions at the end, unless you ask anything which is so blindingly obvious that we need to cover it in the moment, then we will interrupt the conversation for it. But the intent will be that you load your questions into the chat and we'll address those at the end. So you are here today as part of the webinar that Tribepad are running with Trust ID. This is being put on with our friends at HR Ninjas. So Tribepad, for those of you that don't know us, we are a recruitment software provider. We're trusted by over 200 different organizations around the UK and beyond. And we provide recruitment software for those. We're really pleased to be able to introduce our friends at Trust ID, to whom many of you will already know. And we're going to learn a bit more about them in just a moment. But the intent for this session is to discuss the future of recruitment, but particularly through the lens of compliance. So how do we make sure that the people that we hire or the people that we go to hire have been through the requisite checks, and making sure that technology and innovation are keeping us at pace. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tony, who you might have already heard talking about the map behind him. But Tony, perhaps you would just give us a brief introduction to yourself and the organization.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Matt, and hello, everybody. So yeah, I'm Tony Machin. I'm the Managing Director at Trust ID. And I've been in the identity world now for 12 years running this business. And Trust ID really was born out of identity. So whilst obviously we're going to be talking about right to work and employee onboarding, generally speaking, we are a broader business than that. We, as well as employee onboarding, we do KYC, AML checks, financial services onboarding, we do counter fraud, we work with police forces, etc. In terms of employee onboarding, that is our kind of core business in terms of client numbers, not necessarily check numbers, but client numbers. We have over 3,000 employers now that use our services, which might be a digital right to work scheme. It could be share codes. It could be in relation to supporting hiring managers doing in-person checks. We obviously also do the DBS, both the digital identity check for DBS and supporting other DBS providers. And we also now have our own end-to-end DBS service in relation, in partnership with another provider. And so you can start our journey as a right to work check and go all the way through to a full DBS check. That's a fairly recent thing. And we've just launched an Irish product as well. So we now do right to work checks for the Republic of Ireland. So yeah, quite a lot of experience. I mean, I would say most people know us now as a brand very much around right to work expertise.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Tony. So if you weren't sure, you are in good hands, everybody. So, Tony, I wonder if then, first of all, you've already referenced this a little bit, but if you can talk us through what is legally required then of organizations when it comes to right to work and DBS compliance and identity checks. And I guess we have organizations of different sizes, different shapes from different sectors as well. So how well are or how good is the level of awareness around what is legally required?
Well, let's start with the requirements. So I'm sure people know, obviously, it is a legal requirement to make sure that any employee has a right to work check before they start work, not after they start work. And so that's important. And then, of course, as it stands today, there are three ways that applicants or an employer can conduct a right to work check on an applicant. Since October 2022, they can do the digital scheme, which is for holders of in-date biometric UK passports or Irish passports or passport cards. They can use the share code, which obviously is for the foreign workers, and that's obviously something they can either do through people like us or do directly, access it directly, and they can do an in-person check as well. So Trust ID supports all those three, as I said earlier, and that is what they're required to do in terms of the guidance it's set out is very clear for each of those journeys as to what you must do. I think specifically if you go to the scheme, I think the big thing that people forget is the final imposter check. So whilst they're using an IDSP, certified IDSP in our case, we do all that clever stuff, the technology, and then actually it is still beholden on the employer to make sure the check that we do is actually relevant to the person who actually turns up for work on the day. And that can either be done in person if it's a physical in an office, or it can be done by video. In terms of the share code, it's exactly the same. So you can obviously either use us or do it directly to the Home Office e-visa database, and that same kind of imposter final check is done. And actually, as an aside, that probably the single biggest level of illegal working crime we are seeing at the moment is imposters on both of those journeys. So it is not counterfeit UK passports. We are seeing quite a few counterfeit Irish passport cards, but it's imposters using genuine documents, and it is imposters using genuine share codes, and we are able to detect that. And then lastly, I suppose in terms of the in-person checks, bizarrely, despite all that technology that's being deployed for the first two, actually you turn up, the hiring manager or the employee is supposed to look at the document, make some assessment as best they can as to whether it's real or not, check that that's a person, and obviously keep a copy. And in each of those instances, you then need to keep evidence for 2 years from the post date of them departing employment. The other bit, just to add, in terms of the real current, bring up to speed, that some of people may have seen the announcement by the Home Secretary a few weeks back around really now wanting to focus in on the gig economy contractors. So it's not actually written in the guidance. There was some kind of allusion to it previously, but if you are particularly, for example, in construction, and you've got the main contractor, then you've got subcontractor, and they used to devolve that responsibility because it was the painting and decorating company that employed the painter and decorator. That's no longer, you can't get away with that. So, you've got to make sure that anybody on your site, you've got a supply chain check, and also contractors. If you've got an example I use is we've got a client who runs a very prestigious hotel, and they say, well, okay, what do I do with my tennis coach? Well, yeah, he comes up in April, at spring, you've got to check in. He disappears at the winter, he comes back next spring, you've got to check in again, so making sure. So that's kind of where they're going. You want to make sure that kind of high turnover workforce is not kind of left out. So that's kind of where we are in terms of right now. In terms of sectors, yeah, of course, there's massive difference across sectors. Historically, before the digital scheme, before COVID, I suppose, the main sectors were always going to be around construction, hospitality, healthcare, and facilities management, cleaning, secure, high turnover, low cost labor generally. And that's where you find a lot of that high risk illegal working. Since then, that sector is I could say about 80% of what we did was in those sectors. Now it's very different, because since the digital scheme, it's not about the risk of illegal working per se, it is about the efficiency of which to bring people on board. And so growth sectors are being consultancy, IT, technology, where there's a lot of kind of remote working going on, and they just don't want the person to have to travel in with a document. So very little counterfeit or illegal working in those sectors still, but actually massive growth in terms of that on board. And generally speaking, most people get it right. We'll obviously kind of probably talk about where they're getting it wrong in a second. But yeah, I would still say that the prime risk, higher risk sectors are very much the ones that were pre-COVID as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there was a trigger in there for me around a lot of people don't realize that there's those imposter checks that they might still need to do. So clearly there is still an element of uncertainty. So where are organizations getting it wrong? I'm not going to ask you to do an expose, tell me all of the scary things that you know about behind the scenes, although I would really love to know about that. I'm sure our attendees would as well. But where is it going wrong at the moment?
Well, I think there's as a kind of big picture thing, about 7% of all checks, right to work checks sent to us, we fail on day one. Okay. Now, most of that, and this is not about the employer getting wrong, this is generally about applicants getting it wrong. Now, obviously, we do still do in-person checks, so we are supporting hiring managers, and we do get wrong documents sent to us. But if I take the whole population of those wrongs, most of it is ineligibility. A small number is actually what we call counterfeit and imposters. It's an important number because they are the real illegals and they are the ones you really want. But of course, you can get fined for employing a genuine person but not having the processes in place and all the evidence. So it is important to get it right, which is where we come in, because we don't just check, we don't just verify documents, we check eligibility as well. And if you look at where it goes wrong, so wrong documents, so we still get BRPs, even though they were removed from it as evidence of right to work a long time ago. We still get the odd driving license, bizarrely, that's mainly through hiring managers when they're uploading something for us rather than the digital scheme, because obviously our digital scheme would not allow that to be uploaded. A big one is on the share codes, where actually, if you don't know this in terms of evidence of turn time, a lot of students obviously go for work, certainly in the events, part-time hospitality, you need appropriate term time evidence around that. So that's often missing around that. And then obviously there is then what we call the technical issues. Now, this isn't failures, it's facial biometrics. Facial biometrics works to a certain level, and if it doesn't hit that threshold, but then we have a whole team here at Trust ID. We're quite unique. We have a big team of analysts. And so if something comes in and says it's clearly wrong, so you haven't got evidence of turn time, it goes back. And of course, they can redo that and get it and therefore resubmit it. Facial biometrics, if it goes wrong, we don't just say no. We actually have qualified people who look at that and go, hasn't hit the technology threshold, but is it the same person? Yes, it is. And therefore, we can then go on and pass that. And then as I said earlier, we've then got the absolute fraudsters. In terms of the imposters, and saying, as I said in my introduction, the imposters, and this is where you've got to really be careful if you're not using technology. It is probably the fastest growing crime, and people will turn up with genuine documents that look right, they will turn up with genuine share code reports, but is it the person stood in front of you? And that's quite a tricky conversation to have sometimes. And so people might not have that, which is why the technology just takes all of that, and that remote using people like us and other IDSPs takes that kind of concern and that friction away as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you've already hinted at some of this then in what you've just said, Tony, but in terms of how the landscape is changing from a recruitment perspective, how are you seeing the technology, I guess, shaping what happens?
Well, I think technology is constantly improving, and I think the real hard work and the real investment has been made. And the digital scheme was a big kind of step forward, and so that ability to do things remotely is here. And whilst the mechanisms of that, the facial biometrics might get better, the liveness test might get better, the document verification might get better in response to kind of threats around AI and etc. That bedrock is now there. It is, and it's how do we kind of get more people into that, rather than is technology going to evolve more. Having said all that, of course, a massive topic at the moment is reusable digital identity. So you can do your check once and do get, well, that's fine with a passport, but then what about eligibility? What about if a share code has got time limitation on it? How does all that work? So I think we're a long way away from having reusable right to work, whilst the ability maybe to have a driving license on a government or a private sector wallet is probably closer. How that whole thing interoperates, what the commercials, where the responsibility, there's still a huge amount of thinking to be done on that. So I think I say 90% of the benefit of digital is already there, because I can send an email to the candidate, they can take a photograph of themselves, they can take a photograph of their document, and you're done. Right, I move in 2 years' time, I may have to do that again. Well, if I get a guest link or a same email, I'm going to have to maybe put a barcode of my identity in my wallet on my phone. You might save a few seconds, but the key part is taking that whole remote journey, and that's being done in many ways.
Yeah, you mentioned 2 letters in there that I think will have made our HR ninjas ears prick up. The buzzword that is going around at the moment, AI. What's the impact of AI on ID checks? And I guess specifically, how big of a threat is identity fraud and this idea of AI impacting that? Can you speak into that a bit for us?
Yeah, I can. And I had meetings with the Home Office and DSIT just yesterday, and we were talking about this very subject in terms of what that looks like. And of course, one at a very high level. So it's an arms race, because actually, ultimately, yeah, are the counterfeiters getting better using AI? And can you go on the dark web and buy? Of course, you can. In the same way, the verification technologies are countering that and getting better. But just to take the alarm and the heat out of that conversation, because there's a lot of public debate about this and how great it is. Our evidence is very clearly that in right to work and employee onboarding, there isn't the money going around to pay for these sophisticated documents. So the documents that are being used, the counterfeit documents that are being used, are still generally of a reasonably poor quality, and therefore are going to be picked up all the time. And don't forget, we only use a medium level of confidence to right to work, which kind of states that the reality is that we're not looking for a very high level of confidence with 3 light scanners, because the quality is pretty poor. Now, we're obviously always monitoring that. We've not seen any movement. And that's kind of supported by this evidence, clear evidence that we have about what counterfeits were looking like pre-Brexit, pre-COVID, where we had huge amounts of European ID cards, which are no longer allowed. But we've now gone into this digital world with share codes. And what we've seen is this massive, massive increase in imposter crime. Well, they're doing that because they can't get hold of cheap, high quality British passports, because they are very difficult to counterfeit. And whilst AI can replicate them, they can't replicate them to a level that is then affordable to your average illegal worker. So whilst AI is out there and is being talked about, if you take it back to the realities of life, yes, we have to leave it to our experts to counter that and monitor it, but it's not going to be something that I think we need to worry about per se. The biggest thing you need to worry about is, are people using genuine documents, and are they the owner of that document?
Yeah, so sort of on the risk matrix, it's the likeliness bit, which is taking it down there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the facial biometrics is improving all of the time, and the liveness testing and all that kind of stuff is improving. But again, it'll never be 100% perfect, which is why we have humans sat behind it to make sure that we can kind of make that final decision rather than throwing it back to the employer.
Yeah, excellent. The avid listeners at home with their bingo cards will have been excited to not just tick off AI, but COVID and Brexit in one answer. So
Yeah,
we're doing really well. We're going to get a full row there. But
I think also the thing about AI, I'm actually involved in something else with using AI in the recruitment, which is around reading job descriptions and if you get into AI, the other thing to say about AI, on the face of it, it's great, but if you actually test AI on something that something quite a lot about, you'll start to see holes in AI. So again, I think that's the debate that's going on, is AI is just a great big supercomputer of data. It's not thinking for itself. And so, yes, it's faster, it's more powerful. But I think to a certain degree, it's going to ease the whole recruitment process, because it's going to make things easier. But one also has to be wary, like in our particular area, got to be wary that you don't rely on it overly.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned then facial recognition is improving. Can you share any other sort of recent innovations around specifically digital ID, right to work, and DBS checks, and also maybe springboard us into what you think might be coming down the tracks in the next few years?
Yeah, as I kind of pointed to, I'm not sure there's been a huge. I mean, I think the big step was the launch of what we're now called by the codes, by the way. So that maybe is something I should just mention. So we keep calling about schemes. Actually, now we should be calling them supplementary codes. And again, just for the audience's kind of background information, is that obviously the schemes that we're very used to talking about, the right to work, right to rent scheme, and the DBS schemes, they are going to be owned. The guidance for employers is still going to be owned by the Home Office in terms of issuing the guidance for what the employers and landlords should do. But the actual rules are going to be now written in these what's now called supplementary codes. And so that will be run by DSIT. And so we'll have this dual responsibility. So DSIT will be responsible for organizations like mine, which is the IDSPs and the technical part of it, and Home Office will retain ownership of the guidance for employers, and hopefully the two will come together. But my recent experience is that they don't always come together, classic government, but we'll work through that. In terms of technology, I think I've almost, where's it going to go? I think from here, from where we are, Again, it's not going to be essentially the technology that's going to evolve massively outside of that wallet. I think it's maybe because the inclusion of other documents and the ability, therefore, to make the technology more accessible to a greater proportion of employees or potential employees. And so therefore we're talking about out-of-date passports. I've argued until blue in the face with the Home Office that it's far better that a out-of-date passport be sent to us to check it for its to verify it, than it for to be presented in front of maybe a HR administrator who hasn't seen how are they going to verify that with confidence and what have you. And so we have this bizarre rule that out-of-date documents, out-of-date passports are not allowed for digital. We are in the DBS scheme, 6-month-old passports are allowed. Right. So we have kind of made that point. In the same way, I've kind of made the point that if somebody's got a birth certificate and proof of NI, because they don't own a passport at all, then actually, if you were to put that against and use a driving license with that as a facial, or you've got a photograph evidence on there, we can validate driving licenses very well digitally. And therefore, my average analyst here do about 3,200 document checks a month. They see a lot of these things, so they're going to pick up, eligibility challenges a lot easier and know whether that birth certificate is real. We can't verify it; it's just pure assessment. But if we put that against a driving license, then that would help include other people into that digital journey. I think that's a stretch. I think the out-of-date passports has been acknowledged. I think that my idea about the driving license is maybe a stretch, but that's right. So it's all about bringing more in because the technology is there. We've just got to use it.
Yeah, and it sounds to me, at least as a non-expert in this field, that the technology can evolve as quickly as you like, but actually the regulatory side of things, that's going to dictate the pace of change, isn't it? And I guess, is it a bit of an arms race? The technology can do this. Can regulation catch up, or regulation goes further than technology? Do you have a sense of which is outpacing the other?
Technology is far outstripping the pace, and it's not
a silly question, but one I need to ask.
Yeah, but no, and it's not just the legislation. It is then how the government department's responsible for the legislation and acts the legislation. So you've now got this bizarre, and again, I've had this conversation several times with the Home Office, and I think they get it, but it's the way. So they rushed through, for obvious and good reason, the digital schemes. Okay, because COVID happened, there was a massive demand, and we wanted to do that. So legislation had to be written specifically for the schemes. What it didn't do is tie into the rest of the right to work legislation. So we've now got this kind of bizarre situation where I say you've got the 3 channels, you've got the scheme code, you've got the share codes, and you've got the in-person checks. And of course, an applicant can choose. But actually, for one, if you do it right and do your in-process checks, you get a statutory excuse. If you do share codes through an IDSP, and it's not an IDSP, it's doing your share code, it's an IDVT, because legislation says IDVT, not IDSP. Well, you won't get a statutory excuse, but you probably will because you're using technology to take away all that risk. The whole thing is just not joined up. And there's an opportunity now with the technology and the way that the market's going, not only bringing that together in right to work, but also tying that into DBS. Because at the moment there's a risk of them diverging. Never mind that they were written together, came out to bring together so you could easily do a combined right to work and DBS check. Well, DBS are thinking more about the documents and increasing, whereas Home Office are thinking about more about verification. So there's a long way to go around, getting the technology and the providers of the technology to work efficiently in the market. Now, I think it's come on leaps and bounds. I think it's a fantastic. We've done very well out of it, and lots of more clients and employees are doing it. But I think we could get even more take up if the government kind of slightly got its act together a bit better in terms of making the guidance clearer, because the technology does what the technology does.
And it's clear, even listening to you talk, that's exciting, that the idea that we can bring those 2 converging areas back together and just streamline the process for everyone. The context here for our listeners, I was going to say, for the people attending the webinar from HR Ninjas today is, for the most part, they will be either HR professionals, perhaps recruiters with expertise in that area. And there may be this lingering question around how do we balance getting the right level of compliance with being able to move at pace. So we know that recruiters are under pressure to fill gaps, to fill empty seats, to be able to make the essential hires that allow their organizations to move forward. But there's also this big flashing red warning light in the back of a lot of people's minds saying, if I get this wrong, there's some, pretty sturdy implications for me and my organization. So how can recruiters, HR professionals, and businesses and organizations at large strike that balance between speed, compliance, and risk management, all of those things all together? And if that's too big a question, we could split that out. But I think that's probably where we want to go to.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of parts we say that question. So if you take about speed again, as I said earlier, I think the lines, in terms of the digital, we've taken there's an example of an NHS trust that from the time where they were going to make the offer to getting to ward was 17 days, because they once they've decided, gone through that whole recruitment process, and then they were going to, right, well, actually we're going to offer that person that job. Oh, right, we've now got to do the identity check. And in the NHS, it's not just the right to work and the DBS, it's also the NHS identity. And so, the person had to come in specifically with their identity and then go home. And so, that's gone from days to hours, because you can send out the guest link in terms of, yes, there's a risk of leaving it maybe too late, and you might want to do it earlier, but that's an individual kind of employer decision. But yeah, we've taken a lot of that time out. I suppose the other thing in terms of just seeing that compliance piece is that, again, we all talk about the digital and the speed and the efficiency that's created in terms of the recruitment process. But clearly, when you can't do digital, so my question is, on compliance, what happens when you can't do digital? The applicant doesn't want to do digital, and they may not want to do digital for very good reasons. Because they know digital schemes are robust and good, and they've got facial biometrics and all the other things. And yet, and so we see this kind of, I want digital, and then actually they're still taking, and hospitality would be a great example of this, where actually they want to do an event. So yes, they've got a big database of people. They'll choose them, they'll know them, they'll send their guest links out, and they'll do all the digital stuff. But likewise, if you're running a restaurant, people might walk in off the street looking for the job and say, and so a hiring manager's got that, and then the hiring manager has got to remember, right, okay, am I going to send a guest link to this person, even though I've seen in person, because that'll take the press, or am I going to actually look at the document, see if it's real? Am I going to send it to Trust ID for validation and verification? And so our recommendation is, if somebody's walking off the street, it shouldn't just be a case of looking at it and photocopying it, because the risk of the digital scheme, the risk has pushed generally more people to the easiest routes to get work with the least scrutiny. And that therefore means that people should be, as we do through you guys, provide that whole suite of protection around each bit. So digital, very fast, share codes, very fast, in person is what it is. But as you go down that, the level of risk, go the other way, the level of risk increases. So the in-person is the highest risk. Share codes got a lot of imposters, and then we've got imposters using real documents in the digital scheme. In terms of where, people ask me a lot, where should we do it therefore? Well, I think on balance, if I go back to what I said earlier, while 7% of right to work checks are turned down, mainly a lot of that is eligibility and wrong documents. Ultimately, on a second attempt, most of those were, it's less than 1% of people who are doing counterfeit and imposters. Now, they're a very important 1%, because if you get one and you are subject to an immigration enforcement, that means they're going to go through your whole process and systems, in detail. So most people still take the chance that, balancing, spending all the money on checks further up the chain, and then doing more checks on people that probably won't be offered the job. The balance is that most people actually wait to the last minute and go, well, I can now know I can do a right to work check very easily, very quickly. I'll do that and hope that it isn't a counterfeit or a dodgy document. And just, going back to your compliance piece, don't forget also, it was a few years ago, but a lot of people have forgotten this, that the Immigration Act was strengthened back in 2016. And so it's no longer, and people talk about the fines, but actually it's a lot more impactful now in terms of that. So now that the implications of having immigration enforcement finding something means that they can close your site, your business, for a matter of days whilst they do investigation. They'll notify you to all other government agencies. Obviously, it's now a criminal offence if there's evidence of deliberate, and that goes from either the employee who's employed the people, insider trading, if you want to call it that way, and obviously can go all the way to a board, and then there's obviously the fine. So the whole thing is a lot more, for the sake of a bit of time and effort, taking the technology. And every month we still see about 175 new leads coming in from businesses. And that predominantly is a lot of smaller businesses, because a lot of smaller businesses don't recruit people. They can't find a solution out there. And we are one of the few businesses that will sell a very small number of checks. We will sell a business 10 checks. We might sell 100,000 checks to McDonald's or whatever, but we'll sell a business 10 checks, because it's important that they are protected in the same way.
Yeah. And I suppose going back to what you were saying about the time in the process to ask those questions, I think what we see a lot from our customers, and I guess you will see the latter part of this, but we almost see a two-stage process. So the initial stage, maybe at the point of application, is, do you have the right documents, or what documents do you need to sort of raise the flag up the flagpole to the candidate and say, by the way, you're going to need these things. Start thinking about it now. Screen yourself out if you don't have them, or let us know what's going to be required. And then towards the point where you're going to be making an offer to a candidate, that's when you then invoke the real checks. So it's almost a bit of self-selection, and then going through like a dummy and a test run, and for the eventual checks. So that's a way to stage it for organizations that don't want to do it too early, so that they're putting candidates off potentially, or thinking, why would I go through all of this process if I haven't got the guarantee of an offer on the back of it? But it's still,
that's where something. So you talk about innovation. That's where some of the kind of product initiative comes in as well. So we've developed this, which you guys offer, is this digital to condition. So so this is not new technology. This is kind of product development around that. So it's like, so you think, well, actually, a lot of people start on the journey and realize they're going through, and the question is, is your passport in date? And you say, well, no. Well, at that point, of course, you're not allowed to do a digital scheme. But actually, we could still validate that document. So that comes to us. We still validate it, and we send a conditional answer back. And the conditional answer is, yes, that's a real document. You don't need to worry about its authenticity. So you've got the report confirming verification. Obviously, you still go your passport, but actually, you must still see that document, physically see that document before the person starts work. And that's the condition. But at least you've kind of ticked those boxes and said, well, I know the person has a document that is eligible. I know it's real and what have you. But all I now need is a trust ID. I've got the trust ID report. So when the guy turns up with his document, I can do it. I can match that against the report. And that's become incredibly popular. And in the same way as them bringing the other initiatives to try and bring elements of the process together. So digital to conditional brings the digital into a non-digital journey nice and smoothly. In the same way now that if you want to start life and you want to do the DBS at the moment, you can start life, but you'll get your digital identity, your DBS identity report, and then you'll have to go off and use your DBS provider and use that report as the evidence. Whereas actually you might want to just carry on through a journey and just have the applicant do all that seamlessly. And I think that's where the next phase of initiatives is going to come. It's reasonably fragmented at the moment. There will be these products that will come together to make compress parts of these journeys and make it more efficient.
Yeah, and I guess the risk element is what's going to accelerate some of that, and how much can we mitigate the risk? Something you said, Tony, that I just want to check my understanding of. You talked about the potential fines, which I think most people will be aware of. You also talked about the individual who's recruiting the new recruit, and potentially some liability there. That's fresh to me and scary. Could you just share a little bit more about what that means, and I guess how we then, as employers, offer protection to our people to avoid those sorts of pitfalls?
The change to the Immigration Act in 2016 was to try and raised the bar in terms of businesses taking this seriously. And it clearly did that. We saw a big uplift. And what it was trying to do was kind of, put the threat out there that says, listen, you may have in your organization somebody that's in cohorts with people smuggling. Okay, so how are these people getting with fake documents in that time, as it was prevalent, it's obviously pre-COVID. So it might be an insider job. It might be somebody who knowingly and is being paid backhander to actually place people on a construction site or in a food factory and what have you. And obviously they wanted to close that loop. And so they was putting very clearly that actually, yes, if an employee it can be evidenced that they were knowingly recruiting illegals, that's the key, knowingly, then there's criminal sanctions. It's now a criminal offence. In the same way as if that was happening, so the business and the directors, now it's never happened to my knowledge in terms of that, fingers crossed, but it was deliberately put in there to make sure that people, so that you're making sure that your HR, and as a director of a company, I'm making sure that my HR processes and people are all correct, and not only just the right to it, but actually the people doing the checks and all that kind of stuff. So it's normal kind of business risk management. Because what you don't want to do is end up realizing that actually, if you're in construction or in recruitment for construction or staffing, you've put a whole load of people in, and actually somebody within your own organization is being paid to get those people on that site, as part of the overall organization. So that's what it was there to close. Risk, in probability terms, probably extremely low, but very, very high impact should it actually happen. And it's the same, we use that kind of analogy so much in the NHS, where probability of a clinical person getting into work, with patients on a fake document is very, very low, but the impact is very, very high. And we have seen it happen a few times, but in all the years that we have been working with the NHS, it's incredibly low in terms of that risk. Whereas in healthcare more broadly, in terms of social care, it's a far more prevalent, but that's a very different market.
Yeah, for all of us who are potential consumers of the NHS, I think we're pleased to hear that the incidences are relatively few and far between, but you don't want to be on the wrong end of that. So
when it happens, they'll come after you, because we've supported, in criminal cases, we've had to give supporting evidence.
Yeah. Okay. So very shortly, we're going to be opening this up to questions from the floor. So for those in attendance, you ninjas out there who are sneakily hiding, if I can just encourage you to put any questions into the Q&A, which we'll pose to Tony in just a moment. But I guess I have a final thought that I want to pose to you, Tony. And this is slightly unfair, because I'm going to ask you to be Mystic Meg and to get out your crystal ball and I guess to start predicting the future, which is based on what you know now and your experience now. And by the way, the caveat to that is you are privy to some, we're aware you're privy to some inner workings of the Home Office and the Cabinet Office and the way that the government works, given your privileged position. So we're not going to ask you to divulge anything that you shouldn't. But what do you see being next in the worlds of digital identity and right to works, and how is that likely to affect recruiters? And just as a final part to that, I want to give our attendees something to take away and to consider. So, what should they be thinking about when their heads hit the pillow at 9:59 tonight and go, oh, maybe here's what I can start thinking about for tomorrow?
So I think in terms of changes, the incorporation of more documents to make digital more accessible, I think that will come along. And I think, wallets are out there probably medium to long term in terms of reusable, but I think there's a long way to go, as I said earlier. I think in terms of, when you go to bed thinking about today, I think about your supply chain. If you have a supply chain, think about your gig economy. If you've got people coming on contractors, how are you checking those? What robustness? And I think I've said several times now, make sure that every right to work channel Digital, we all understand it's pretty straightforward because you have to use an IDSP, so there's no question on that. But on your share codes, if you've chosen to do that yourselves, have you got robust imposter kind of defenses in place? And if you're doing in person and you are leaving it to just a hiring manager, are they suitably trained? That is where immigration enforcement, if they come in and they go, oh yeah, great, on your digital checks, you're using an IDSP, tick a box, right, share codes, you're not using an IDSP, or how you're doing your imposter checks, we'll have a look at that now. And then, what training have you given all of your hiring managers if you've actually still doing an in-person checks? And people have kind of started to forget about that whole thing because it's a much smaller number because digital's taking off. But it's the biggest threat. So that's what I would do. Think about your supply chain, think about all of your right to work channels, and make sure that each one is equally robust.
Yeah, and I guess as someone who, this is me now speaking, I'm away from the day job. I'm chair of a board of trustees for a charity. I'm also chair of a board of governors in a school. So I have my hat on, thinking safer recruitment. How do we make sure that we're doing all the right things we need to when we appoint internally for those? It's making sure that those policies that I sit and review once a year, which are HR policies, safeguarding policies, all of those sorts of things, are not just pieces of paper that sit in the background that have been decided by some dusty person like myself and have no bearing on the day to day. It's making sure that people understand the significance without being overwhelmed by the repercussions of getting these things done, making sure that your right to works are done in a timely manner. As you said right at the beginning, before someone starts, not after someone starts, and that the reason for them being done is not just to tick a box, not just because it says so in your policy, but because actually it's a really important part of the process. There are implications for the organization and potentially the individual if there is nefarious activity. So that's I think one of my key takeaways in there, just to emphasize the people side of why our processes are in place.
Yeah, and my last other thought maybe for guys say, wait, I mean, don't forget the technology is there. So we're talking about technology. The technology is there. It's adoption. It's how people want to use and adopt technology. And also, don't forget that an identity check, whilst we're talking about right to work and talking about DBS and everything, an identity check, the single biggest crime that is actually affected against businesses is insider crime. People who turn up and actually affect crime from the inside. And so, as they walk through the door, do you know who they are? Because actually, if you don't know who they are, and I actually have first-hand experience of this working on a construction site many years ago, worked on one day, the next day we came in, and the container, all the equipment had been stolen overnight. And it was a guy turned up and we said, well, who was he? Well, nobody knew who he was because it was just nobody checked him. So he disappeared, nobody knew. So we talk a lot about compliance with right to work and compliance with the legislation. But in a simple business sense, actually don't also think about it is actually a good way of actually protecting your business against all sorts of fraud.
Yeah, and that actually leads us nicely into a question that has come in, which is around those imposter checks. What is an imposter check and how do I as an individual complete it? So take you back to your construction site. What should have happened, albeit it was way back when, I'm presuming?
So I think, again, the guidance is always not as clear as it could be. So, of course, we are doing an imposter check as an IDSP in terms of making sure that the person who's taking the selfie is the person in the document. And that's where we're finding a lot of imposters. Yeah. The imposter check has referenced into the guidance. That means that post the digital check, whether it be an IDSP scheme check or a share code check, those are from a database technology that you then get a piece of paper back from those various organizations, either from the Home Office database or from us. And it's actually, and that might be, going back to your point, a few days before work has started, or even a couple of weeks before work has started, because you've appointed, you want to do the right to work check. So when they turn up on day one of work, you must make sure that the check that the IDSP or the report returned from the Home Office e-visa database is the person that's turned up for work and not somebody else. And you must get the report out. You must check them either in person or you must check them online if it's a remote job. Now, bizarrely, there is no requirement to record that imposter check.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Which is Again, madness, but obviously I think they thought in terms of the bureaucracy. Now on an in-person check, you have to take a photocopy and keep a photocopy on file. You need to keep your share code and you need to keep your IDSP report. How is an immigration enforcement officer ever going to know whether Tony Machin, you've got a IDSP report, Tony Machin, he worked here in 2021, he's now moved on, but I'm in my 2 years time period. Tony Machin's gone off in the distance. How do they know? So there is no record. Now, some organizations are trying to adopt technology or to adopt their processes to confirm that somebody and the hiring manager has seen and confirms that they've seen and done that imposter check. But there is no requirement in the guidance to do so.
No. Okay. So it almost becomes a self-certified.
Yeah.
I have done this, but there's no, other than me saying I've done this, there's nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. Do we have any other questions from the group or from the chat or from the Q&A that we can pose to Tony? It's been super interesting, Tony, for me to hear some of this from the other side of the equation. I come to this from a recruitment background. I'm very aware of the need to fill roles and to do it in a timely manner. I think this is emphasizing to me that it's not just a case of put a bum on that seat, but it's making sure it's the right bum in the right seat and that you're accountable for that. I've got one last question for you, just in case anyone else is wanting to pose a question. You've got another 30 seconds or so before I turn off the tap. And it's just a really simple thing, which is you talk about not having to keep a record of imposter checks. How long do I need to keep the right to work check? Does it expire? Does it? I think you mentioned 2 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's 2 years from the date that they leave.
Okay, right. So we need to hold that record. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 years from the date that they leave, whichever process, whether that's in person, share code, or the code. Yeah, so that's some of the rules are pretty straightforward, and others more complex. But that's one of the simpler ones.
Yeah, excellent. So if organizations are storing that information in their ATS, have a vested interest there, then they need to make sure that that's held for 2 years. If it's going into their HR platform, which is probably the most common place for it to be held, or their payroll system, they need to make sure that that's held for 2 years after the individual has left. Excellent.
Don't forget, Matt. I mean, the other bit that is as a last key message, if there's no questions, is whilst we've talked a lot about the consequences of getting it wrong, we don't sell what we do on fear. No. What we always sell is actually it compresses that recruitment time. So you talked about the efficiency when every piece of evidence says that we save time and money. We save time and money in terms of the recruitment process, but also save time and money in terms of the overall compliance, because these checks would have had to be done. So if you can do them quickly, you can do them cheaply, you can get an answer back, then it's efficiency and the saving, the cost saving that we kind of tell potential clients about. Yes, they always want to know what's the fine and consequences, but actually we never go in and say, if you don't do this, you'll get this, this, and this. What we go in and say, you have to do this. So it's not a choice. You have to do this. So let's make the cost of compliance cheaper and make your process more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great key message to leave us with, Tony. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Some really, really interesting nuggets of wisdom there, and certainly some things that we can take away and be thinking about tonight as our head hits the pillow and as we go into tomorrow, and some thoughts for the future. But for anybody who has any further questions, Tony, would you be happy for people to get in touch?
Absolutely. Always happy to take questions. More questions. I'd like to get clarity on this thing, because some of it is not as easy as I make out when you read some of the guidance. The number of calls I've had with lawyers of big international companies around things like share codes and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot. So I do understand it's easy for us to talk about this, and sometimes you go away and reflect on it. So I'm always happy to answer any questions that might arise after the webinar.
Brilliant. And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Probably just to email me, and if Bethan or somebody wants to make my email address available, tony.machin@trustid.co.uk. But again, if you want to get in touch with you guys, please do send them my way, and we'll be very happy to answer.
Excellent. Brilliant. And likewise, if anyone watching either now or in the future wants to get in touch with Tribepad, you'd be very welcome to get in touch I'll be on matt.is@tribepad.com, but we'll share both of those emails in the roundup from this event. And I suppose it's just two things from me. The first is to say a huge thank you, Tony, to you for your time, for not just the hour or so that we've spent together, but also your preparation in coming to today as well, and so clearly thinking through a message which is really clear, really strong, and really important as well. So some great reminders in there for us. And thank you everybody for your time in watching. I hope that's been useful. I know it has been for me, and I know it will be for you as well. But I have to say, I hope, just in case. But it's really great to be able to share this information with you. Ninjas, we value your participation. We really value the partnership that we have with HR Ninjas. So hopefully we've been able to give you something of value today as well. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.